So now, I'm going to share with you now, as we begin the Gospels, a very important point. Through the years, I've seen many people come over to Israel, and a lot of them think that they're immediately going to turn the world upside down, and they're going to witness and win everyone to the Messiah. And I think these, many well-meaning people I have seen come in and begin to speak to people, and then a rabbi or someone that is schooled in the Scripture who is not a believer then ask them a simple question. They take them to Matthew chapter 2, verse 23, and they read this out of the King James Version of the Bible. Jesus came and dwelt in a village called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which is spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. And then the person will say, where in the prophets is the Messiah ever called a Nazarene? And you can search for the rest of your life and you will never, ever find it. Now, there's a problem here. Because it says, spoken by the prophets, he should be called a Nazarene, but you can never find where he's ever called a Nazarene. And so you think, well, Nazareth, Nazarene, it sounds like a Nazarite, like a Nazarite vow. But when you look at the details of a Nazarite vow, you find out that Yeshua never even tried to fulfill that. Not even close to it. And yet, this hangs out there, and I see these people get down in the mouth and completely stumped and walk around in a daze for days. Well, there is an answer to this. Because Isaiah prophesied and said, there shall come forth a rod out of the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Now, Isaiah tells us that the branch is a particular type of branch, or a particular type of tzemach. And so we will read it again. There shall come forth a rod, which is a shoter, which is a living shoot. Is a living shoot out of the stem of Jesse. The word stem is gizah, which means a cut down trunk. So get this picture in your mind. That Jesse, the father of King David, would be a cut down trunk, and out of that cut down trunk would come a living shoot. And a branch, and the word branch is netzer. A branch shall grow out of his roots. Now, a netzer is a shoot that grows out of the original root system of an olive tree, but it springs up later and somewhat distant from the original trunk. Listen to this very carefully, because a netzer is a very precisely defined agricultural term that applies only to an olive tree. Because an olive tree, you can cut down the trunk of an olive tree, and generations later, out of the original root system, a living shoot will come up that is removed somewhat distant and at a later time from the original shoot. This is what the prophets have spoken of, that the Messiah will be a tzemach, a branch, but that branch is a specific kind of branch, a netzer. Now, this is an olive tree in the land of Israel. There's a lot of foliage here in the foreground from another tree, but this trunk is nearly 2,000 years old. There is very little that's growing out of this original trunk. It is hollow, it is dead, it's decayed. However, about 1,500 years later, this is when a netzer shot out of the original root system over here on the right-hand side. 1,500 years later, and at a remote time and somewhat distant from the original trunk. That is what a netzer is. So now when we read this, Yeshua came and dwelt in a village called Nazareth. This is right down the road from my house. That it might be fulfilled, which is spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a netzer. That is what the prophets call him, a tzemach, which is a netzer, coming out of the original olive tree of King David's family, but removed in time and somewhat distant from the original trunk. Now, watch how the story develops. Because two families of netzer from the lineage of King David are what's recorded in the Gospels. In Matthew, it says that David begat Solomon, who begat, and it gives us a family tree. Now this is David begetting Solomon. We have the kingly line, do we not? And he, then, after many generations, it says that Jacob begat Joseph, the Givrah of Miriam. Now in the King James it says that Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, but we have to remember that the Bible wasn't written in English. In fact, the English of Matthew was translated from the Greek. But all the early church fathers said that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language. And several did their best to translate it. Now we know that our Greek translation of Matthew came from the Aramaic because Aramaic words still remain in the Greek text. But all we have to do is go back to the Aramaic, and this is how it reads. Jacob begat Joseph, the Givrah of Miriam. Not the Baalah husband, but the Givrah, the mighty man, the father of Miriam, as whom was born Yeshua the Messiah. Now when we do this, we find out that there are actually 14 generations then. That Miriam's father, his name was Joseph, and his father's name was Jacob. So Miriam's father's name was Yosef ben Yaakov. Yosef ben Yaakov. Okay, that's what Matthew 1, 6, and 16 say. So Yeshua was a netzer, a direct descendant from King David through his only earthly parent, Miriam, the daughter of Joseph. Now, in Matthew 1:17, it says that Joseph, Miriam's husband, Baalah, being a just man, not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily. This is a different Joseph. This is Joseph ben Eli. And Joseph ben Eli, we go to the Gospel of Luke and we see his lineage. The English translators, seeing both men named Joseph, made the mistake of calling both of them her husband. Whereas the Aramaic says one is her husband, her Baalah, the other one says father, Givrah. Now, we're going to see that Miriam bat Yosef was married to Joseph ben Eli, who was a netzer of King David through Nathan, the son of David. And that's what we read in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, and then further on, Yeshua was the supposed son of Joseph, who was the son of Eli. Not Jacob here, was he? So she was married to Joseph ben Eli. And then we take the family tree all the way up and find out that David's son Nathan was the family tree of Miriam's husband. Now it begins to make sense. Except, why did two family lines of King David live in the village of Nazareth? 265 years before the Common Era, that is when Antiochus Epiphanes, a Syrian Greek general, came in and occupied Jerusalem. He took over the Temple Mount and he set up on the Temple Mount a statue of Jupiter, a brass statue of Jupiter. You all saw one of them in St. Peter's Cathedral, did you not? He set up a statue of Jupiter on the Temple Mount on Jupiter's birthday, December 25th, and declared Jupiter to be God. And that same day, they roasted a pig on the altar, the sacrificial altar on the Temple Mount, thereby conducting the first Greek Orthodox Sunday school picnic on the Temple Mount, defiling the altar, and then war broke out soon after that. Sons of priests, the Maccabees, 3 years later, overthrew the Greeks against insurmountable odds. They got up on the Temple Mount. They broke down the statue of Jupiter. They then destroyed the altar and set up a new altar and began the process of dedicating the altar. The Torah tells us that it takes 8 days to dedicate a new altar. And that is what they began that day. That holiday became known as Hanukkah. Hanukkah in Hebrew means dedication. It's an 8-day dedication, an 8-day feast, because that's how long it takes to dedicate the altar that they put up to replace the one that was defiled by the swine flesh. And so, but what happened during this period of time when Antiochus had took over is that the Greeks would inspect your children. If you had a male child and they found him to be circumcised, then they would take their sword and run through your baby boy. All around Jerusalem, in Judea, Bethlehem, that whole area, it was a bloodbath. And it was during that time that people from the family lineage of King David moved from Bethlehem and they went up into the area called the region of the Gentiles. Galilee of the nations is literally the region of the Gentiles because many Gentiles lived in that area. And so all of these people from Bethlehem, from family of King David, went up and settled in the north, and they made a little village called Nazareth because they all knew that they were Netzers, that they were of the family tree of King David. Mary's father's line came from King David through his kingly line, and Mary's husband Joseph, who was no relation to Yeshua, was he? But yet, he was also of the family tree of King David through Nathan, not the kingly line. And so, at the time of Yeshua growing up in Nazareth, that is when all these people in this little village of 300 or less, they all knew that they were all from King David's line, and that's why when the commandment to go back to your original hometown and register your support for naming Caesar Augustus the father of the Roman Empire in the 25th year of his reign, that's why Joseph took Miriam back to Bethlehem, because that's where the ancestral home was. But Nazareth is where the Netzers from Bethlehem had been living for over 200 years at that time. And so now we begin to understand a little bit more of the rest of the story.